Hello and welcome back to the Summer Day Studios YouTube channel. In today's video we're going to be looking at creating a procedural metal shader, and by procedural what I mean is you won't need any kind of perfect UVs or texture maps. We're actually going to be doing it all with Arnold and Maya nodes in the Hypershade editor. Metal is a material that can be quite easy to make quickly, but unless the metal is literally fresh off the factory floor, it's probably going to have some damage and weathering like rust and scratches. Like most materials really, it's going to be a little beat up after time, right? So let's take a look at how we can achieve that with no texture maps at all. And this kind of method, you could say it's lazy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy. You know, this shader can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be, really, with as many nodes or as little nodes as you want, depending on the effect that you want to create. So let's jump right into it. I'm just using a free asset today of a bench vise, just because it's got some nice shapes to it, but feel free to use any shape whatsoever. You could even just use a default sphere as well if you wanted to. It'll work on that too, literally anything. So to begin with, select your model. We're going to hold down right click, assign new material, and we're going to add an AI open PBR surface just to start off with. And before we do anything else, I am going to create a Arnold sky dome light. Just like with our glass texture in last week's video, we're going to want a HDRI for the lighting and image for the lighting so that we can have reflections, because a lot of metal's material and appearance comes from reflections rather than the color of the metal itself, okay? So go ahead and create your sky dome light and then come to the color checkerboard here, just click that and then go to file. I'm going to go to where I keep my sky dome lights, and again I'll provide a link in the description to where you can get those. Ambient CG and Polyhaven are great sites for free ones. That's where I get most of mine, and I would highly recommend to get those, and they come in various different resolutions from 1K all the way up to 8K and 16K, I think, even in some cases. So I'm just going to go with one that I like to use normally. There's a few settings I like to change on here before we do anything else, and that's turn max bounces from 999 down to 10. 10's a much better number. 999 is far too many. It's just going to slow down your render. I also like to turn exposure up to 1 just to make this a bit brighter. And I come to viewport as well and just set this to 0, just so that we don't accidentally click it. We don't see it in the viewport, but it will still work as a light. So if I go ahead and click render up here and then go to Arnold, we're now going to get a live preview of our model. It looks like the sky dome light's still coming up in the background. If that happens, just turn camera in the attribute editor under visibility, turn it down to 0. And we've got a nice black background. Okay, so we've got a good amount of light on here, but right now this isn't very reflective and it looks more like plastic. So let's go ahead and fix that. Come to the attribute editor and go to your PBR surface material, and we have a slider just under basic called metalness. I'm going to turn that all the way up to 1. You can see now this looks like a bright, fresh metal, kind of like some sort of steel or aluminium or aluminum if you're from America. And that's okay, but like I said earlier, we can make this look a little bit more weathered and more interesting. So with our model selected, let's go ahead and open up the Hypershade editor by clicking this little blue orb up here. And then select your new shader over here, the AI Open PBR surface, and then just press this little button here and that will graph that here so we can see it in the grid. It's a good idea just to rename this as well whenever you're making new shaders, and with anything really, just to keep things organized. I'm going to name this something like metal shader just so we know what this is. And we have a lot of different inputs here, and that can get a bit overwhelming, but don't worry, the ones we're really only looking for here are the roughness for today. And the roughness is going to reflect or affect how much reflectivity this has, how rough the surface is. If you imagine the difference between, you know, the panels on a car and sandpaper. Panels on a car is very, very reflective, whereas sandpaper, not so much, right? You're probably not going to want to use that as a mirror. So if I was to turn the roughness all the way up to 1, you can see this looks more like the plastic that we had. If I was to turn this all the way down to 0, you can see now this looks like some sort of chrome mirror-like surface. So we want a bit of breakup in the variation of this. We don't want it to all be one uniform level of roughness. So to do that, we're going to create a noise texture, and this is where we get into the procedural nature of this, because we don't need any image textures or UVs. You're then going to come to the left-hand side here where we've got a bunch of different options, but click on 3D textures. Now we've got a few different options in here like leather and fractal and volume noise. 3D textures unlike 2D textures, are essentially just materials that are projected from 3 different axes, or multiple axes at once, so that we don't actually need UVs because it's kind of projecting in on our model, if that makes sense. And it's going to allow us to do this entirely procedurally. So go ahead and create a... let's go with a volume noise to begin with. And we're going to take the out color red, not the out color. If I was to just try and take the out color and plug that into specular roughness, you can see it grays out there. That's because what we need here really is an alpha value, a value between 0 and 1, or black and white. So you could use the alpha as well if you want. I just like to use out color red. So we'll plug that into the specular roughness, okay? Now if we keep our node selected here, the volume noise, just so that we can see how that's reacting in the viewport, you can see our model now looks kind of speckly, and that's because the volume noise, you can see here in this little preview, is black and white. So you can see that the black areas are where we're getting this darker patch, which is actually just the reflectivity of the metal, and the white areas are where we're getting this whiter patch, which is the roughness. So if you like, the black on this texture is a roughness value of 0, and the white on this texture is a roughness value of 1, and then we can have all the different shades of grey in between. So by adjusting this volume noise, we can adjust how rough the surface of our model is, of our shader is. So one of the things I like to adjust straight away is the frequency here. It will depend on how big your model is. The default's 8, and that's maybe a bit too much, but one of the settings we can also adjust is the amplitude. You see, if I turn that down, we're getting a bit more of the reflectivity of the metal coming through a little here. And if I was to put that all the way to 0, we're just entirely shiny, right? Or all the way to 1, it's pretty rough. So there's a setting we can adjust there. We can also adjust the frequency. Let's say if I put that to 2, you can now see that the rough patches are a lot bigger. Whereas if I was to put that to 16, it might take a bit longer to render. The rough patches are a lot smaller. So kind of adjust this to your liking, depending on what kind of metal you want to create and how weathered this is going to look. You can adjust things like the density as well here. You can see this is making it so that we've just got a few little specks, whereas most of the material is quite rough, or quite reflective even. I sometimes like to reduce the density quite a bit and then increase the threshold so that the overall shininess of the metal isn't too intense, but we're still getting some little flecks here of increased roughness. You can also change the noise type, right, to Perlin noise or to volume and all sorts of other things, but generally billow, or maybe Perlin noise, but generally billow is going to be good enough for this. Something else I also like to adjust here is the size rand or size randomness. I like to put that up to 1 just to add some more variation here. And you can see just by adjusting the sliders, we're very, very quickly getting a bit more of an interesting look to this material. It looks a little bit more weathered already, like it's had maybe some water dry up on it or something like that. Moisture in the air and scratches and that sort of thing. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with that, just for the roughness, but there's something else we can add here. Right now the surface, while looking a bit more beat up in terms of the reflectivity, it's looking a bit flat. We don't really have any dings or dents or bumpiness to this, so let's go ahead and add that too. And again, we can use another volume noise shader. So we're going to go ahead and create a bump 2D node to begin with, and plug the out normal into the normal camera. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and create another 3D texture volume noise, and we're going to plug the out color red into the bump value. Okay. Now if we come back to our scene, you can see now that our model looks very beat up, probably way too bumpy. So with your bump node selected, the default value of 1 is going to be really, really high for the bump 2D node. I would recommend turning this down to something like at least 0.1, but even then you can see how this is really, really intense. So even something like 0.01 is sometimes better. You can see here now this is looking a lot bumpier. And it's still quite an intense depth, you know, even a fraction of the percentage. But we can adjust this a little bit, because right now this is looking a bit like tin foil. So we can adjust the volume noise just like how we did with the roughness, and we can decrease things like the amplitude, the size randomness, and the density as well, just to break up this a little bit, make it so that the bumpiness isn't quite as uniform, and it just looks a little bit more interesting. I might turn down the density even further, down to something like 0.29. So you can see we're getting a much more interesting looking surface now, where we have a difference in roughness, we have a difference in the bumpiness of the material, and it's a decent bit more interesting to look at than just the default metalness already. And we're doing this all entirely without any image textures. And you could go even further than this and you know, experiment even more with different percentages in the sliders and try and make something as realistic as possible. Okay, so there's another step we can do now. So metal, often as it gets older, it gets rust, right? When it gets affected by water and the air, eventually the metal, unless it's stainless, oxidizes, I think is the word, and you get rust on the surface. So how do we add that and get it in the little creases where you'd expect rust to be, where all the water accumulates? So to begin with, we're going to create a new shader. Okay, so click your model, and we're going to assign another new material for the time being. Come back to Arnold, and then go to AI Open PBR surface again. And don't worry, we still have our old model from before, our old texture from before. But we're going to rename this one Rust Shader. Okay, and I'm going to change the color to something like a deep orange, like kind of a burnt orange reddish color, maybe something like this, sort of rust colored. Okay. And then also rust, pretty rough material, so we're just going to bump the roughness all the way up to something like 0.9 around the area. We're not going to use a roughness map specifically for the rust because it just is very, very rough on its own. We don't really want it to have much reflectivity. So now if we open up the Hypershade editor again, we've got our rust shader in here already. I'm just going to pull that out of the way on its own for the time being. And we're going to create another bump 2D node because rust is more than just a bit of a burnt orange color. It's normally quite a bumpy surface as well. It has a lot of flakiness, a lot of surface kind of undulations as well. So we're going to create another bump 2D node, and we'll also create, maybe we'll try a solid fractal this time for the bump, and we'll see what that looks like. We'll plug the out color red into the bump value. Okay, and you can see now we're getting a very, very, very rough surface with the default settings here. And it's not too far off what we're kind of going for already, right? This looks like an entirely ancient, like this thing has been out in the rain for who knows how long, decades. So we're going to tone that down a little bit later, but let's kind of refine the roughness, or the rust material to begin with. So to begin with, I like to adjust just the fractal. I'm happy with the value of 1 for the bump texture, or the bump node. We can maybe reduce the amplitude a little. We can reduce the frequency ratio as well, maybe down to 1 might be a bit low. Maybe 1.8. The frequency here is very, very sensitive to changes. If I was, you can see there, to reduce it to 1, it looks not bumpy enough. So I kind of like 1.8 here. I think that looks pretty cool. Nice and textured, okay? But rust also generally isn't just one color. You kind of get various different shades of yellows and blacks and deep browns and oranges, right? So how can we create that effect? So we can actually plug in multiple colors into the base color. And to do that, we're going to create something called an AI mix shader. If you just press tab and type that in, you can delete this little blue node here. We don't need that in this case. You can see it's got 2 inputs, right, for shader 1 and shader 2, and an out color and a mix. So how can we plug in 2 different colors into this mix shader? Well, we can type in AI flat. Again, delete this little blue node because we don't need it. And an AI flat is essentially just a color node, and that's it. It doesn't have any other information, it's just color. So we can select the orange rust color we made earlier from the rust. I'm going to take that and we're going to plug that into shader 2. And then I'm just going to press Control D on this to duplicate it. And we'll make this a bit brighter. Maybe we'll have it a much brighter orange. We could make it a little bit more yellow, something like that. And then plug that into shader 1. And then we'll plug the out color into the base color. If we look at our model now, you can see it looks a bit more like a big Cheeto. It doesn't really look like rust anymore. And that's because we haven't utilized the mix node right now, or the mix input. Right now it's just mixing the two 50-50, and it's creating that horrendous yellow color. So to do that, to create a nice mix, we're going to use another 3D texture, and in this case we will use a volume noise. And we're going to take the out color red, or the alpha if you want to do that, and plug that into the mix. Okay, with our volume noise selected, we're going to come back to our scene, and you can see now we're getting lots of speckles, and we need to reduce the frequency a little bit so that this isn't quite as intense. So let's turn this down to something like 3, or maybe even 1. And you see now we're getting kind of like a leopard print, a giraffe print kind of texture, but you can see what the noise is doing is, unlike with the roughness, where we had black for shiny and white for rough. In this case, black is showing through the original rust color that we had, and white is just showing the yellow color that we created. So it's essentially saying anywhere that's black, we want this orange, anywhere that's white, we want this yellow. And by adjusting the noise, we can adjust how much of each we have. So you can see how powerful this is just to create a shader really, really quickly, just by using 2 different colors in a mix node. So we can work on adjusting this even more. And if you're not happy with the way this is looking, like if I was to reduce the density here, you can see it's becoming more yellow. I would rather that be the other way around. So what I'm going to do is plug the reddish color into shader 1 instead, so that the controls here are inverted. So if I turn down the density now, you can see it becomes a bit more orange. And now we have less of the yellow, okay? I'll go ahead and probably increase the size randomness again. The depth max, by default that's at 3, we can increase that to 8. That just gives it a little bit more detail in those spotty sections. Maybe what I'll do is adjust the color of this a little bit so it's not quite as intensely yellow. We'll make it a bit more towards... actually, I don't mind that. We'll keep it kind of like that. But you can see here you can experiment with this, change the colors, change the amount that the color is, the variance of the color, if that makes sense. I might even increase the density a little bit so that it's a bit more obvious. But you can see it's very, very easy to quickly combine 2 different colors together, right, to make a more interesting material. So now that we have a rust texture, how do we go ahead and combine that with our metal one? So what we'll do is we'll come back to the Hypershade editor, and we're going to create a new AI mix shader. This time we're going to keep this blue node because we need this. And we're going to rename this metal mix or something like that. Okay. And we're going to take the out color of the rust, and we're going to put that into shader 1, and the out color of the metal and put that into shader 2. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're actually going to apply this metal mix shader to our whole model. So right click that and then go to apply. And you can see now what's happening is we're getting kind of a weird mix between our metal and our rust. Like how we did when we first used that mix shader, it's because, as you might have guessed, we need to plug something in to the mix input. And what we're going to use for this is AI, ambient occlusion. AI doesn't stand for artificial intelligence, by the way. It means Arnold, just in case anyone of you were wondering. And we're going to take the out color red from here and plug that into the mix. Okay, now if I minimize this, you can see what's happening automatically is that we're getting only the rust in the areas where surfaces are close together, like between the 2 grips of the device here, in these creases, towards the base of the device, and also between the actual handle here and the front side of one of the clasps, one of the grips. And all AI, all ambient occlusion it's a shading technique in 3D that kind of simulates how ambient light is blocked by objects, darkening crevices, holes, and areas where the surfaces are close together generally. And you can see that represented here by the 2 vices being closer together. If I was to move those apart, we would get less of the rust in that section. So it's kind of taking advantage of the shape of our model, and you might not notice this as much if you use this just on a sphere, for example, but if it's on a model like this, we have multiple surfaces coming closer together, you can see that we're getting this rust in these crevices. So you can see how by using not that many nodes, you can very, very quickly create something that looks a lot more realistic, just using entirely procedural techniques, no textures or UVs required whatsoever, without even having to leave Maya at all. And this does have its drawbacks, right? You couldn't paint on detail as well. You can't paint on detail at all like you could in texturing software like 3D Coat or Substance Painter. But for creating quick materials for projects where something might be in the background, or if you don't need that kind of hand-painted look or technique in order to get something look exactly right, like maybe you're not copying something from reference, it's not like a particular reference piece, then this is a perfect way to do it. And yeah, I hope that's all made sense. If you have any questions at all, please do let us know. We're probably going to do a series of these on how to create various different metals and materials in general procedurally in Maya, because I know it's a subject a lot of people find quite intimidating. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Have any questions at all, let us know, and till next time, I'll see you later. Bye bye.